All right, age discrimination. Most of us know by now that the CDC has identified those 65 and older as high risk for COVID. That hasn't changed since the last time we gave this presentation. So does that mean that you can do what you think is necessary to protect those 65 and older? You would think so, but the answer is no. Okay, this is our second quicksand avoidance, right? You don't want to step in this stuff because it's hard to get out of. So even if your intent is to protect employees who are at a higher risk, according to the CDC, you cannot treat workers 65 and older less favorably than other employees when it comes to return to work. Now, on the flip side, you can provide additional flexibility to those 65 plus, and you can treat those who are less than 65 less favorably. Okay, so why is that? Because maybe that in itself sounds discriminatory to you. Well, it's only because the CDC has identified those 65 and older to be at higher risk for COVID. Okay, and the EEOC is supporting that. Because remember, the CDC gives advice in terms of not spreading illnesses, et cetera. The EEOC is taking that data and then interpreting it as to how you're supposed to apply it in the workplace. So if you have to choose between the CDC and the EEOC because you think there's some conflict, you go with the EEOC because they're the ones who are governing the workplace. The CDC makes recommendations that have to be interpreted by the law, okay? And we're going to talk about how important it is to follow some CDC recommendations as well later on in this presentation. But also remember that if you have someone who has an underlying condition like cancer, type 2 diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and there's obviously a host of other things, they're also at higher risk regardless of their age. So that triggers the CDC to recommend that high-risk workers should stay home or shelter in place, as they call it, rather than report to the workplace until a final phase of reopenings occurs. And because 50% of the states continue to have increases, who knows when that's going to be. They also suggest that employers also consider high-risk workers be assigned duties that minimize their contact with customers and employees. However, third quicksand, I'm probably going to lose count, but I think I'm on number 3. This is only if the employee agrees to it. So what does all this mean? Here's a few takeaways. You should not implement any forced involuntary transfers. So for example, my ex-employer, City of Kansas City, Missouri, had an EMT paramedic who died from COVID. He was 65 years old. So without getting too detailed, but it was in the paper, you can Google it. Even though he was in a high risk category, he had the right to continue to work the job that he got chosen for. And he chose to continue to work. So the law is rarely, if ever, friendly to employers who take a parental view when it comes to applying workplace decisions, because if they negatively impact certain groups, then you're subject to a lawsuit and you're probably going to lose. So while you may be on the one side thinking that you're protecting someone, that employee has the right not to choose to be protected. So you can offer alternatives, but you can't force it. Okay, let's move to pregnancy and family responsibilities. There's really not going to be much change here, but I still think it's good to go over because it's a common thing that you might face in the workforce. So this is similar to what we just talked about. You're not able to be parental with COVID by thinking that it's best to exclude a pregnant employee from work out of fear for her safety or the safety of her unborn child. Again, none of this is new law. This is based off of a landmark case that happened decades ago, where a woman worked in a facility that was around toxic materials. Her employer transferred her without her approval or asking her to a safer facility. And they did it for reasons whose intent was good, all right? They wanted to protect her and they wanted to protect her unborn child out of fear of a lawsuit. And because they thought it was the right thing to do, which usually gets you on the right side of the law. But on the surface, this looks like a good move. The problem with this particular case, though, is that most of the people who got promoted out of this work facility to the next management level came from those that worked in this facility. And since men can't get pregnant yet, guess who got all the promotions? Well, men did. So when they moved her out of that facility, it was deemed to be discriminatory because it infringed on her rights as a woman and it lessened her opportunity to be eligible for promotions or to be considered for promotions. So some of you may be thinking, okay, but what if something happened to her child? Well, the law is clear again that that's not your call. That's her call. So she could ask to be moved. You could offer to move her, but you can't mandate or retaliate if she chooses not to move. All right, so in regards to issues of family responsibilities, employers can provide flexibility to employees in general, as long as they don't treat people differently based on gender or any of the other protected categories. So in other words, you don't single anybody out. That's where the do the right thing comes into place. And finally, the law also doesn't change in respect to the fact that pregnant women are still entitled to reasonable accommodation under the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, and if they have medical complications, under the Americans with Disabilities Act. All right, let's talk about establishing a safe workplace. This is where the CDC comes in. When establishing a safe workplace, remember that temperature checks are an additional way to protect your employees when they come back to work, but this doesn't relieve you from all the other responsibilities that the CDC has recommended that you implement in your workplace. So these include the things that we already see when we walk into other places of business, right? Including your own, encouraging and monitoring social distancing, facility cleaning, offering personal protective equipment, etc. I mentioned that you should be doing health checks every workday. Remember, that means every day, even if a worker has said they have no symptoms. If a worker shows signs of COVID, yes, you can ask them to take their temperature or ask the worker to go get tested for COVID. And yes, you can send them home. However, before you send them home, like all management actions that I would recommend, COVID or otherwise, grab another supervisor, have them verify what you think you're observing in that person. So don't go at this alone, okay? And consider centralizing it so that maybe you have the same management team review these close calls. Because again, that's just going to enhance the consistency if you have the same people who are trained and know what signs to look for, okay? Also, reach out to the HR or your legal reps because they expect for you to call them and they'll be disappointed if you don't, obviously. So some of you may also be thinking of this, so I'll mention it. For those employees who may not have a legal right to an accommodation but could benefit from it, consider allowing alternative work arrangements such as telework. So this could include those that are 65 plus, but it could also include those who are living with a family member or someone who is at a high risk. And as you heard from Jeff, communicate, communicate, communicate. Be sure these policies are communicated to all employees and those decision-making supervisors so that these requests are handled consistently. And simply emailing the policy or leaving it on somebody's desk or mailing it to their home is not enough. You have to explain the policy and have a question and answer period. I say you should always have an FAQ that is posted on your website. If you don't have a website and you have employees who are coming in, be sure that you post it in common areas, usually a kitchen area or a break room area where you can clearly show that you're trying to be as transparent as possible, okay? Have the employees sign off that they have received the policy.